everybody. Thanks so much for joining the show. My name is Dr. Dana Lee Pertermann. I'm the Anthropology and Sociology Speaker Series are sponsored by Bay Area Archaeologist Student Club here on campus. So if you would like to help them bring in more speakers for the students and for the community, do exciting field trips and other events that they sponsor, please, if you can, donate at their Venmo account, which is Bay Area Archaeology. Bay underscore area underscore archaeology. So to get started, also, if you are on our Facebook Live event, feel free if you want to leave a question in the comment section on the Facebook page. We are monitoring that live, so if you do want to make a comment or leave a question, please do so. And our wonderful tech people will tell me what that is, and I'll be able to answer it for you. And also, if our audience has any questions, please feel free to speak up, and I'll try to answer as best I can. So, right, what I have been doing for the last 5 or 6 years is an attempt to try to digitize what is left of the Oregon Trail, particularly in Wyoming, where I was based. So the Oregon Trail is really unique in that it's an artifact in and of itself, right? It's a uniquely American artifact. We don't have anything else in our sort of modern world that is a trail of this extensiveness. The Oregon Trail extends for about 2,000 miles. Of course, it's following previous Native American trade routes, but it goes through lots of ancestral lands, and that's something that is really important to me as a conflict archaeologist. I really wanted to look at not only at the American experience of immigrants moving west, but also of the conflict that ensues and what kinds of repercussions the immigration of the Oregon Trail has into today's modern world. It is really important to remember just how extensive the migration via the Oregon Trail was. There over 400,000 people traveled the Oregon Trail, but between a very short time period, about 40 years or so. That's almost 500,000 people. That is, I made this great graphic. This is actually from a really great website called nativelands.ca, if you want to take a look. They have done this really amazing overlay of just how many different Native groups were existing pre-1492 and all the way up to today. Of course, everything overlaps, and we have some information that's, better than others. And then I've written in the Oregon Trail just briefly here, and we'll talk specifically really about this little area right here, where the Oregon Trail breaks off and sort of splits and becomes 2 or 3 trails before it merges back together. So here's an even better map, okay? So the Oregon Trail goes through a number of really important areas as people are traveling from Independence all the way up to where we know and love here in Oregon. We have a number of places that are listed here, such as Ash Hollow is a really important spot on the Oregon Trail. Chimney Rock is also another really important spot. But some of these other ones perhaps are not so well known, but they were incredibly well known to those who were traveling down the Oregon Trail. Diaries that we have access to attest to the fact that, for example, if you were going down the Oregon Trail in your wagon all by yourself even, you knew to look for certain markers, certain landmarks. And one of them, very importantly, was Independence Rock. Independence Rock is in Wyoming. It's a very famous site in which quite a few immigrants left their mark on the rock as they were moving west. There's also, it's called Independence Rock specifically because if you were not there by July 4th, you needed to turn back. If you were not there by July 4th, you would not make it to the Willamette Valley before you froze. Yeah, so that's why it was called Independence Rock. And it's a very, if you take a look at it on the landscape, it's something that's very starkly, you can see it in the distance. And that's one of the cool things about Wyoming, particularly, is that the landscape hasn't changed much. So when you're looking out at the landscape, you really can see what these people saw, almost 200 years ago. I wanted to, the Smithsonian has actually created this amazing website, 9 places where you can still see wheel tracks from the Oregon Trail. Now, there aren't many places in the United States in which that still exists, and there are some amazing pictures of those wheel tracks today. And I did want to mention that, so it's just at the smithsonianmag.com, and they just Google 9 places where you can still see the Oregon Trail. Maybe I should stop sharing. Did I do it right? Oh dear. It made it go, oh. It made it go away. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that the trail in Wyoming is quite extensive. For the most part, you can see the trail from end to end. in Wyoming. Except for in just little bits of it, the trail still exists throughout Wyoming, and so it makes a really great place to study the Oregon Trail and to see if there are things we can learn using modern techniques. These are some, for example, these are some wagon ruts that actually still exist. It's a slightly muddier area in Wyoming, so the wagon ruts go quite deep. But for the most part, this is what the landscape looks like throughout the trail, and that's really specific to Wyoming because of one specific plant, sage. So sage is a very, very hardy plant. It's a desert plant, but it does not like to be disturbed. So once you disturb sage by crushing it with a wagon wheel, it does not like to grow back. It takes about 100 years for a mature sage plant to have been basically crushed to grow back, right? And so like lots of plants here in Wyoming, they don't take any time at all to grow back. You can pull those out of your garden and they come right back next week, right? Not so in Wyoming. There's very little rain. It's considered a proper desert. It doesn't have a lot of trees. It doesn't have a lot of vegetation. So there's no precipitation hardly, and there's no bacteria that is disturbing the topsoil, right? So you can really see the marks that are left on the landscape. Right? So one of the things I started thinking about coming out of Texas, where I got my PhD at Texas A&M, I was using geophysical equipment like electromagnetic radar, magnetometers, ground penetrating radar. And I asked myself, if we can locate battles, and that work has been done extensively. If you want to look up Douglas Scott, and he's the one that did the modern archaeology at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. If he can do that and figure out how a battle happened, what else could we use these types of geophysical techniques for in terms of archaeology? And so I started thinking about roads. And especially in Wyoming, I started thinking about the Oregon Trail and trying to determine whether or not GPR could actually be used to see the original trail versus other types of trails, right? And there is some evidence that that's the case. And the pictures that I have up here are actually of a roadbed in Norway. It is a Viking road. This was actually someone else's PhD work that I collaborated with to figure out if he could see this, then what could we see perhaps in North America? So he actually saw this, right? This is what he saw in the GPR, and then he actually then recreated the roadbed that the Vikings would have possibly have made. This is really useful because one of the things about archaeology is that it tends to be very destructive. Normal archaeology, traditional archaeology, is a destructive science. Well, we don't want to be cutting into the roadbed of what Oregon Trail still exists because it is going away. It's a disappearing artifact, right? So we don't want to be destroying what we have. We want to be trying to use other techniques that we have to learn what we can while still preserving what is there. So that's my methodology. I found a section of Wyoming that's fairly remote, even for Wyoming. This is near Farson, Wyoming, and it's called Parting of the Ways. It was a specific section of the Oregon Trail in which you could decide at that point really what your end game was going to be. This is where the Mormon Trail, the California Trail, and the Oregon Trail diverge. And so the parting of the ways, it really was sort of your last chance to make this decision. This was a big decision that people made. And if you made the wrong choice, right, as we've all done in our favorite video game, you could end up having a problem. You could end up dying. You could have family members that died if you made the wrong choice of the trail that you were going down. So I actually used a ground penetrating radar device made by the company called Noggin. They are really very portable ground penetrating radar devices. They come in different megahertz, and I picked the 250 megahertz because I wanted a lot of detail in a relatively short, shallow space, right? So I'm looking just underneath the surface to see if I can see any sort of footprint or thumbprint, any sort of signature left by all of these, the compaction of the wagon wheels over time. So here's just another a chance of looking at that picture. And the sublet cutoff, which is what right where parting the ways happens, is this little section. You see it right there. That is the sublet cutoff. It was named after a French trapper, Sublet, who a county is now named for him in Wyoming. He found this shortcut, basically. But it's a dangerous shortcut. So it's a shortcut if you had food and water provisions. You could shorten your journey by several days. But if you don't have food and water provisions, the sublet cutoff has no fresh water. So from the time you leave the parting of the ways until you meet up with the main trail again, you have no access to fresh water via the land. So you had to have those provisions yourself in order to use the sublet cutoff. But that fact that it was a shorter route, right? It's a much easier route than going all the way around, could actually save your life. One of the really interesting things about doing work in Wyoming is just how many markers or trails, tombstones, other things of civilization, other markers of civilization just exist out in the middle of nowhere. So to get to Parting of the Ways, you have to take this forest road that is not serviced. It's not a graded road. And you have to take it in several miles. Your GPS goes out. There's no opportunity to call out anymore. And you just have to trust in God to get you there. And you get to this area, and then all of a sudden you see the fork in the road where the Mormon Trail goes off, and the California and the Oregon Trail continue on, and then there's another fork where a little bit farther out where the Oregon Trail and the California Trail then also diverge. But you see this marker. You've been driving for about an hour because you can only do about maybe 20 miles an hour on these roads. And you finally get out into the middle of nowhere, and then all of a sudden you see this, and it says S cutoff, that way. Okay? There's been not a lot of testing of this marker. I did some investigations with newspapers and talking to locals. From the information that's out there, especially with the Bureau of Land Management Field Office out of Rock Springs. This marker has been documented since before the 20th century. So if this marker wasn't there specifically from 1840 to 1880, it must have been put down shortly afterwards. And it strikes me as that doesn't make a lot of sense. If it had been put down shortly afterwards, surely they would have put down some sort of, hey, this is where everybody says, some sort of plaque or some sort of other type of marker. But this is a very basic sort of marker. It's about this high. This is really meant to give directions, okay? It's not meant as a placeholder. It doesn't strike me as something as it's meant to preserve our history. This is a street sign, right? And so I don't have a TARDIS. I can't go back in time and find out myself. But it strikes me as an archaeologist who's seen other types of these markers all over the world, that this was a marker that was there for immigrants who were traveling. Okay. Now, to put another side to that, there is another place on the other side of Farson that has a marker. This marker was actually put down, I want to say, by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And it was put down in the 1940s or so, 1950s. And it's pretty extensive plaque that says Parting of the Ways. It's got a nice little, wagon and a family, and it talks about exactly what I just said, that this was the area in which you had to say goodbye to people maybe in your convoy. They were going one way and you were going the other, and that you really couldn't change your mind afterwards. If you got on the Willamette Trail, you were going to the Willamette Valley at this point, right? There's another marker, and you see it in the foreground or in the background there, that lists names of the dead. It's a memorial marker that was placed again after the fact, like in the 30s or 40s. This is not where Parting the Ways is. The trail, there is a trail that comes right through here. We've GPSed this, and we've global positioned that trail, and it also has been, we've done a little bit of GPR on that trail as well. That's a modern trail. And I'll show you some archaeological evidence that shows that that's a modern trail. It's obvious that trail was not created by wagon wheels. And but again, it's very difficult in Wyoming to tell how old a trail might be, made by ATVs or made by wagon wheels. We've had to do a lot of research about how wide wagon wheels would have been in measuring these trails, as opposed to modern conveyances. But they didn't know any of that back in the 40s or 50s. This is just where the people in charge came and said, oh, well, you can see a fork in the road. This must have been Parting of the Ways, which was a famous place. It was well known. Like I said, it's in the diaries of people who were on the Oregon Trail. And they decided to put this marker here. It's not correct. And that's part of the work that I've been doing with the Bureau of Land Management, to try to correct some of this false history using the archaeological evidence as our clues. Okay? So the GPS or GPR from Parting of the Ways, the actual location came up with a very distinctive digital signature for these wagon wheels, as you can see, right? And if you do the math and put it to scale, these markers right here and right here actually do match up really well to the width of a Conestoga wagon. which is a very distinctive wagon, as people may be aware. It was the main conveyance for these 400,000 people along the Oregon Trail. Obviously, there are other trails that people use, such as the famous Mormon handcarts. Obviously, those would have been much smaller and left much less of a distinctive digital signature, right, in the ground that the GPR is actually able to distinguish from other mud that has not been compacted in this way. So I've got a comparison here. So the top one is the wheel compaction traces at the parting of the ways, and they're distinctly different than the wheel compaction at the false parting. These compaction marks here match much more to modern road bed. So this false parting is an area that the road was constructed probably, I'm guessing, in the 20s, maybe 1910, 1920s, you know, somewhere 1930s even, somewhere right around there. I don't know if people know, but automobile races were actually super famous in Wyoming. The early automobiles in the United States, kind of like early NASCAR, to try to make it across Wyoming. There's a lot of places in Wyoming that are particularly flat, and again, don't have a lot in the way of vegetation, just, you know, the sage, right? There's no trees, right? So it's fairly easy to get across in these sports cars of the day. Right? Yeah, you got to look up some of the cross-country races that happened in like the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Amazing. Okay. So what's it all for, right? What did I do all of that for? It's great to say, okay, we can actually recognize digitally, you know, preliminary, let's say, we can recognize a Conestoga wagon rut, right? Especially one that has been so gone over with the same size of Conestoga wagon over and over and over again, as is in Wyoming on the Oregon Trail. But, of course, that's not what I want to do, right? We want to talk about the human condition, not just what kind of roads we made, right? But what does that tell us about behavior? And what does that tell us about the behavior of the time? And what does that tell us about today's modern world, right? So the things that people were doing back then have consequences to today and into the future, right? And we call that conflict event theory. In archaeology, we use conflict theory to talk about the artifacts, and that the artifacts can actually tell us clues about the behavior of the time and what people were thinking, right? Because that's always what we're trying to do, is get into people's heads, right? All of these individual decisions that were made, whether or not to go towards you know, Salt Lake, whether or not to go to the Willamette Valley, whether or not to go to San Francisco, right? All of those were individual decisions that were made because of lots of different reasons, right? Maybe you had family, but maybe your kids just died on the Oregon Trail, and so you're going to make a different decision based on that, right? Whether or not you chose to drive or take the Oregon Trail in a convoy, or whether or not you chose to do it individually. All those little individual decisions add up to major consequences, and that are still being felt today. So one of the things that doesn't get talked enough about, I think, when we're talking about the Oregon Trail, is how many people didn't make it, right? So the estimate roughly is about 20 to 25,000 people died specifically on the trail, right? And these are some of them we have gravestones for, some of them we don't. I find it really interesting how different the tombstones are. Sometimes we have found with GPR, we have found just burials with no markers. Sometimes we have found very extensive burial markers. Sometimes we have found really basic ones that are just kind of plain. And then someone, right? This is E. Brown, and he died August of 1857. So one of the things that interests me when I look at artifacts is always how long it took someone to make that artifact. Right? So whoever E. Brown was, right, even though that's a really basic marker, right, that still took someone at least a day of scratching with probably a nail into a stone to leave that marker for their friend, for their family member. That whole day that someone took to make that marker meant something to that person, right? That was a day that they weren't going down the trail. That was a day that they were behind of finally getting to their final destination. And we can speculate that that might have had major repercussions for E. Brown's family member or friend. So the fact that E. Brown died means something. That means something to the history of the Oregon Trail and to what's available to us today. Right? That friend may or may not have actually made it to his final destination, and that's a ripple effect that affects everything that happens from that point. Another really important factor of the Oregon Trail is the extent of forts that were positioned along the Oregon Trail. Because of politics, because of different conflicts that were happening in the 19th century, a number of these forts were not just because of perceived Native American aggression, sometimes extensive aggression, sometimes justified aggression. They were also, people don't, a lot of times don't remember, but they were also against those of the LDS faith. So Mormons, right, were seen as a threat at the time by the United States government, and forts were actually established along the Mormon Trail and along the eastern end of the Oregon Trail, specifically so that troops could be positioned in order to thwart any attempt of the Church of Latter-day Saints to establish their own country. That was a major consideration in the 19th century. Quite a number of troops, supplies, and resources were given to these forts. And that's something to think about as it's someone who's lived in Wyoming extensively. You think a lot about resources, the lack of resources and the availability of resources. A lot of Wyoming today exists because of these forts, such as Fort Pertermann and Fort Laramie and Fort Bridger, because they were being supplied by the full faith of the United States government. A lot of that, those building supplies, the food supplies, and even the people. There are people in Wyoming who are still there today that can trace back their ancestry to the commanders of these forts. And it's also really important to me to mention not only the growth of these United States, but of the impact towards our indigenous community. At the time in 1492, it's estimated in North America, there's approximately 18 million indigenous people. By 1910, that is down to about 300,000 individuals. So the fact that the Oregon Trail exists is important, not only to talk about the growth of this country, but to also talk about the indigenous population and where it has been and how it has survived to this day. So in 2023, one of the best estimate that's out there is people that have indigenous status in this country are at about 5 million. Obviously, that's nowhere near the 18 million that used to be, but it's important to me to talk about the fact that they are still here and that they are thriving and growing and adding to the culture that we call America. I really want to say just a special thank you to my colleagues, Dr. Dudley Gardner. I also do want to say a special thank you to my colleague, Brad Carr. He's a geologist at the University of Wyoming, who helped me with the GPR images that you've seen. And the Bureau of Land Management at the Rock Springs Field Office, who were very generous with helping me with permitting for this work. And again, of course, thanks to the club here on campus, Bay Area Archaeology, who has been sponsoring these events and will hopefully continue to sponsor events next year. So thanks so much for listening.